In this video, we're covering an introduction to Substance Painter and using masks within Substance Painter. Let's start by taking a look at this example model. So I have a sword here which has been UV unwrapped, and you can see that the UV map has no parts that are overlapping, which will be very important for baking things like ambient occlusion in Substance Painter to make sure you don't get overlapping shadows and lines. This is maybe not the most efficient UV layout I could use for this model, but I've tried to lay it out in a way that makes sense in terms of looking at the model and matching up the pieces so you can see clearly what I'm doing. So from the handguard, you can see working my way down. It works down through the geometry. I have these little details here that are all in order from top to bottom. And you can see that whenever I take a look at my UV shells and just go down from the handguard down to the grip and then the pommel at the bottom here. And what I've done with the blade is I have either side of the blade, again not overlapped because of baking maps, and the little bottom part of the blade here is its own UV shell, just so that I could get maximum textile density out of my sword here. But the important thing is that I can look at this UV map and I can recognize whereabouts the pieces of my sword are and what kind of materials are going to go over each piece. So once I've exported that file as an FBX, exported that mesh out, I'm going to go into Substance Painter, File, and New, start a new project. The only thing that we need to do here, I'm using the Metallic Roughness PBR setup here. There's a few different setups you could use, but that'll give me all of the maps that I need. There's also some Unity specific things that you can use. So PBR, and I want Metallic and Roughness maps. File, I'm going to select and find my FBX and select Open. And then document resolution. Now this can be changed at any time, but this is going to be your working resolution for what you see in your scene. So I'm going to change mine up to 2048 by 2048. If you have a really good rig, you could be running it in 4K, but you can output maps in any of these sizes at the end, in fact right up to 8K. So this is just the resolution the textures will be rendering at in your screen, which is really just a preview of what actual map will be output. The rest of this should be fine. For the next option, given that Unity will be what we're importing to for the most part, OpenGL will be our selection rather than DirectX. That determines the direction, the Y direction of the normals, so OpenGL. Here, if you already have baked normal maps in a different program, or you have any other baked maps, you can add them to pop into your material. But at the moment, we're just starting from scratch and we're going to be creating everything in Substance Painter from our model. So that's the main thing, set the document resolution and grab your FBX and press OK. Now you'll be met with the interface with a few different windows. You have the main perspective viewport here. You have a 2D viewport, and if you don't see both of these and you only see one or the other, you can select those by using this little button here at the top, and you can select 3D only, or you can have just a 2D texture map or 3D/2D. Now immediately I see an issue with my model here, and that is that in Maya I mustn't have tagged all of this model with the same material after I'd made it, so some of this stuff isn't showing up here on my 2D model. So I'm going to go back in and re-import this model after making sure that all of the meshes that are combined here have one material attached to them. So I'll pop back into Maya, select my entire object, right click, assign existing material, Lambert 1, to make sure it all shares a material. I think what was happening was there wasn't a material properly attached to some parts of the model, because you can have multiple materials and that should still work. So just delete history and then re-export. Back in Substance, I'm going to go File and New, and again I'm going to set up my canvas, select my greatsword, that's the new greatsword there, and select 2K and OpenGL, and the rest should be fine. Discard the old project. So now we can see everything in our scene. Again, if there are parts missing, try to reassign the material that's meant to be attached to it in your modeling program, and hopefully that'll show up in Substance. So at the moment we're looking at the map with the material view, which shows lighting and everything that's in the scene here. So if I change my lighting by holding shift and right click and then dragging, I can drag the light around. You can see that that also changes on my map here. So that is just showing what I see in my viewport. I can change that then from material down to base color to see the colors I've put on. So far nothing. So this is where we select our maps. So let's look at baking out some maps before we begin painting and applying materials. On the right hand side here you'll see your textures list. So I've got my Lambert texture there, and you can, that's probably where I went wrong before. I had several textures there and I was only clicked into one of them. I have my layers, my texture set settings and display settings here. I have the properties of whatever tool I have selected or whatever layer I have selected down below that. There's also a Python console for commands to be input. I don't need that right now, I'm going to exit that. And then at the bottom of my project I have my shelf that has all my materials and brushes and things like that in it. Right now I want to bake textures, so I'm going to go into texture set settings, and then I'm going to scroll down and take a look at this bake mesh map. So here's where all the maps are attached, normal maps, ID maps and occlusion maps and things. I'm going to bake some of these. I don't have a high poly map to bake a normal right now, so I'm going to detick that. I don't have an ID map to bake, so I'm going to untick that. And I don't want to bake a thickness map that detects the thickness of my model, because I'm not going to be shining light through it. Everything here will be opaque. So what I have left here is, that's most important, ambient occlusion. That'll give me some shading, shadow data. The curvature map, which I'll show you what that does in a second. It calculates the edges of the geometry. And the position map, the position inside the sphere. So all of that will be important. I'm going to change the output size here to 4K. And then scroll down, that's all looking good. And then I'm going to hit bake selected textures. You'll see that baking, and that could take anywhere from a couple of seconds to a few minutes, depending on what you're baking and how detailed your map is. There we go, okay. So now you may notice that we have some extra information baked into our material, things like shading information through the ambient occlusion map. So you can look at the maps that you've just baked by scrolling down to mesh maps, and here you can see the ambient occlusion map that we just baked. You can see it in both 2D and here in the 3D viewer and how it has affected it. So if you weren't happy with your ambient occlusion bake, you could always go back and change the settings in the bake mesh maps before you bake that out. The next map down then is the curvature map, and that's simply looking at the curvature of our model and detecting all of the edges. This program has smart materials here, and the smart materials will detect the edges of an object so that they can make the edges look worn or apply different effects to it. So baking your curvature map is how it basically tells the texture to apply those smart materials. So that's a very important map to bake. Next down on that list is the position map, and that's for looking at the position in the viewport. For more advanced texturing, we may look at that in another video. For now, we want to see how the final material looks, so we can press M, or we can scroll back up to the lighting, the lit material. So now it's time to look at painting or applying materials to our object. You can see here that I have a brush selected and that I can brush directly onto the 3D object. So I can paint onto that 3D object, or I could paint onto the 2D texture map, which is really, really handy for painting details onto your maps. You can change the brush size by using the angle brackets, just like you can in Photoshop. And you have other brush settings at the top here, like the size, the flow and opacity of your brush, like you would in Photoshop. So if you want to paint details onto your brush, that's how you would do it. If you look down to the right, you will see in your properties panel the brush here, all the controls that you have up here and a wee bit more. And then if you scroll on down, you can change the shape of the alpha. So that is the shape of the brush itself. So we could say stamp different shapes onto our model. You can also go into your brushes panel here on the bottom, and you can select, you'll see the alpha changes depending on the type of brush that you select here. So there are all sorts of brushes there that you can use. Scroll on down, and there's a whole bunch of different settings, but you can change here the uniform color, and then I can paint in color on my model. So you could just paint directly on, and that's a legitimate way that you can add detail, certainly. I wouldn't advise adding your base colors that way though. So let's look at the core kind of workflow, the basic workflow for how to get materials onto this. First of all, I'm going to take a look at my concept art to see what sort of materials need to go on this. So I'll open Photoshop, and you can see I have this cold steel here, that's my blade. I have cold iron labelled as my handguard. Then the grip has this dark leather on it, which is broken up by bits of the cold iron here, and also this accent of aged bronze. So that is the four main materials that I'm looking for, is the steel, the iron, the leather, and then the bronze. Important to know at this point, it will save a lot of time if you have concept art to work from whenever you go back into Substance Painter. So let's take a look at doing this steel first of all. Jump into Substance, and I'm going to click into Smart Materials. Now, materials are great and give you some more options to begin with, but they don't pick up your curvature map the way the Smart Materials do. So let's look at Smart Materials first off. We'll give ourselves a wee bit more room on our shelf here just by dragging this up. And you can see that everything's arranged by material, so all the plastics are under P here. So we want steel first of all. Let's take a look. We start with basic steel. I can drag that onto my model to apply it and see how it looks. And then once I've kind of taken a look at that, it's quite cool. It's got some pitting and things into it. You can drag around to see how the lighting plays off the surface. You can play about with different types of steel by just dragging them onto your model to preview them. And you can see here how the edges are being picked up by the curvature map that we've got and changing how it applies to the surface. This can be seen most obviously maybe when you add things like this painted steel, and you can see all of the edges are kind of, the paint will be worn off as though it had been dinged in battle. You can also see that this has dirt added to it, which applies kind of in the cracks in the places that dirt or rust would form, like where water would gather and rust away at our steel. Now bear in mind that all of these previews are being applied on top of each other, so if we scroll into our layers tab, we'll see we have all of these types of steel added. So I'm going to remove those just by pressing delete or the little trash can button. I want to keep this one because I kind of like that, and I'm going to delete the rest. Even the ones underneath, they'll still be working away in the background, so to keep your scene running smoothly, try that when you have the materials you need displaying. So I really like the soft kind of shading effect that this one gives with the darker element. Now it's the wrong color according to my concept, but I'm going to work with that. So I'm going to look at the quality of the material that's applied, and that's a really nice surface quality that I think will work well for this sword. So I'm going to move on to the next material, and then I can go into adapting each of the presets so that it looks the right color and the right shade. So let's rename this layer from Steel Dark Aged to Blade, and I'm going to just keep the original name so I know what I started off with there. So I've got my blade. Now this is applied to the whole model. How do I get this to just apply to the blade? Click this little mask button, it's the same as the mask icon in Photoshop, and go to Add Black Mask, and that will mask off the entire model. Now we want to just coat the blade, so we're going to go down to this little selection, Polygon Fill. It's the fourth tool down in the toolbar on the left. I'm going to select that, and you see here we can select our triangles, polygons, meshes, or UV chunks. So I'm going to try mesh here, and then I'm going to click on the blade, and you see that that entire mesh, everything that's attached to those faces, will now get coloured in the map. So for this tool, we can use either the 2D map or the 3D map to apply those things. And all that's doing is painting bits and pieces of the map out, depending on what's attached to what. If you press X, you'll go from painting black to white, and I can then go and paint out things again. So X switches color for what you're applying to the mask. You'll see here when I've got the polygon selection, I can drag across polygons that I want to reveal, and then again I can press X to change it to black again, and I'm blacking out that mask. And if you take a look at this mask on the right hand side here, you can see what we're doing. We're applying white onto the areas that we want to punch through our black mask, just like we would if we were applying this on Photoshop. Now unfortunately there's some areas here that I don't want to be covered, so I'm just going to go ahead and switch that back to polygon, and I'm going to make sure that I deselect all of those areas. There we go. So moving on to the iron hilt, you can see if I go to I here, I've got my iron forged, iron old in my smart materials. The iron forged looks pretty cool, but it's a little more similar to the surface quality of the steel that I had. So looking at the iron old, I think I'm going to keep this just because it gives a bit of variation in the surface quality. So again, I'll go back to the iron forged old, and I'm going to delete that, and then I'm going to rename this one. That's really the main part is the handguard. So now I need to apply a black mask to this to mask off the entire thing, and then I'm going to bring that back again by using the polygon fill tool, and I'm just going to click on that. Now there's some other parts of this concept that are coloured in with that kind of iron texture, so I could click that and you'll see it'll make the whole handle like that. All I want is this piece here, so what I'm going to do is switch this to polygon fill. I'm going to find this bit here on my texture map, and if I zoom in I can see that it's here. And then I'm going to drag around all of those polys, and I'm going to make sure that I tag that as that type of material. And you can see the pommel as well here. Again, I can do it on the 3D map, but it might be neater depending on how well you've laid out your 2D map. To come down here, find the bits of the pommel, and then mark those off as that material using your mask. So I've got two more materials to find. I've got this dark leather, and I have the aged bronze. Here's a leather that looks quite dark amongst all the different types of leathers. I'll drag that on. See if again we're looking at the surface quality. We can change all of the colors later. That doesn't have the kind of surface quality that I really want on this, so I'm going to keep looking. So I find a leather that has roughly the kind of surface quality that I want to go for. Again, then I'm going to go onto that layer, and I'm going to add in the black mask to mask all of that out, and then I'm going to use my polygon selection here to select just the polygons that I want to be colored with leather. There we go. And you can see I've accidentally selected some of the rings and selected over some of the other information I didn't want to. So that's not really the best way to do that. I'm going to go back into my 2D texture map. Since I've laid this out nice and neatly, I may as well use it and then use that to make those selections. Again, I could press X if I wanted to undo a bit. X again to switch between black and white painting over my masks. Finally, I have this aged bronze. So I find this bronze with a wee bit of kind of aging and wear on it there, and looking at the parts that's going to be applied mainly. And then once I'm happy, I'm going to go in and add again my black mask to that. Make sure the right layer is selected. I'm just going to rename that to bronze will be fine. Leather for that is fine. And I'm going to add in a black mask. Then again, use this polygon fill tool with poly selection. I'm going to select all of those areas that need to have that texture applied. And finally, one part down here above the pommel. And there we go. So let's take a look at what we have. So that's our model well on the way to being textured. There's nice variations in the surface quality of the different textures that I've chosen there. But the colors aren't quite right. So let's take a look at how to go in and change some of the effects that have been applied to the surface. First of all, this blade is meant to be kind of like a lighter, kind of like blue steel kind of look. So I'm going to pop back into Substance. And the way that we edit these materials is we're going to jump into the folder that contains all of this information. So blade, you'll see a little folder here beside my blade layer. I'm going to pop that open. And I see everything that makes up that material. So we have a scratches layer, and they're revealed by this mask that's attached to scratches. So we can edit those masks by taking a look at them. They have different generators attached to them, and you can change all these properties to change how the scratches appear to the surface. But what I wanted to look at is the color. So this is actually an awkward one that I've chosen as an example. But let's take a look at what makes up the color of this. So you can see the metal layer here, and there's a finish kind of surface texture applied. Let's click the metal layer, scroll down, and I actually find this under parameters, and then you can see here there's advanced parameters, and finally we get to the metal color. So sometimes the aspects will be very easy to see, like the color box. Sometimes they'll be hidden inside all sorts of sub-menus. So here the metal color, we can change this and start editing the colors of our blade. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. One really handy thing that you can do actually within Substance Painter is if you want to get an exact color, say to match to your concept art, you can go into, here my metal color for example, click and hold your eyedropper tool. You'll see it'll preview any color you hover over inside your window, but also outside of your window. So if you have Photoshop open in another window, you can actually color pick directly from your concept art. Now, moving on to our next material here, which is the handguard. I can pop that open, and you can see it's not always clear what each of these things do. So if you're not sure, edges, you can just hide and show that by using the little eyedropper tool to the left, or sorry, the little eyeball tool. So that'll hide the iron and then show the iron, so you can see exactly what it is that this iron affects, or here edges, you can see what that affects. So you could change the edge color by messing about with the edges. I want to change the color of the iron, so that's what I'm going to go into the settings of here. The closest thing I could find to a color node on this one was a hue shift, and you can see I can shift the hue here towards blue by just using that slider, and then I can use the saturation to change how concentrated that color is. And this is all tied into another material here called the old iron material. Just so I don't get confused with my windows, I'm going to keep closing those folders after I'm done with them. The next thing is a leather. So hopefully this will be a little more straightforward. I'm going to pop open that leather folder. And here you can see this is a lot more straightforward. It has the damage and the dirt, which you can remove and show. You can even just hide one completely if you think it looks better without it, which I may do for this one, for the damage. May take that away. But scrolling on down to the base color here, that is what we want to change. So I can simply click on the base color, find that little base color slot, and again if I want to match that to my concept art, I can minimize the window, click on it, select the little color dropper, and go over my concept art there, just to perfectly color match it to my color scheme. If you want to paint some extra details onto your model after the fact, you can add an extra layer just by going up to the tool menu here, and if you hover over this you see it says add paint layer, and then you get a blank layer and you can just start painting directly onto your model or onto your texture map from there. You can even paint normals. So here in my brushes I have chosen cracks here. So by default it just paints some cracks over the top of my model, which gives a kind of cool effect there. But what I could do is dial up the height on my brush here, and you'll see that it will actually paint normal detail that's sticking out. Anything that's above 0 and anything that's below 0 will be indented in. So you can paint normals using any brushes, any alphas and things. You can also paint in metallic all of those options are available to add to your brush or to your layer as you see fit, so that you can really customize your mesh and get it looking as good as possible. So that's it for this video. You can see the result by either taking a look in your viewer here, or you can click this little camera icon in the top right that brings up rendering in iray. And you can see a nice rendered view of your model, and you can change all of these viewport settings just the way you can in any renderer. I guess the final thing to mention is how you actually get these maps out of Substance Painter. So we'll look at exporting here. Just click your little iray button to come back into the scene view. And we're going to go up to the left here, File, and then Export Textures. Okay, and you see I have my PBR metal roughness settings that I set up at the start. That should get me everything that I want. Choose where you want to save to here. If you want to see how many maps are being output from this template that you've selected, you can pop into List of Exports, and you'll see I'll get a base color or albedo map, an emissive, a height, a metallic, a normal, and a roughness map from that. So if I didn't want, say, my emissive in that, which I don't, I could go down to my output template and I could remove that here. So that's PBR metal roughness I'm using. Anyway, so your file type here, PNG, size you want to select after the fact, because otherwise it'll just output at the resolution that you're rendering in your viewport here. So I'm going to have a 4K texture. Padding you want to keep infinite for the most part, and that's everything set up. So now we can hit export, and that should export all of those textures, and we'll see how that works out in a second. Okay, so hopefully that will export okay, as this has, and then we can pop into our folder, and you'll see those textures exported, and we'll now be able to use those in Sketchfab or in your Unity game engine, whatever the end goal is for those textures. And that's it for today, guys. Thanks.